Okay. So.
Now, there was a time, there were over 400, are you ready?
Yeah.
There were over 400,000 Jews in Great Britain, and they had no chinuch for the young generation. And I felt that the older generation, the old generation, who came from Poland, from Germany, from Russia, from Hungary and Lithuania, they still had some shaykhs with Judaism, with Yiddishkeit. But the young generation, who were growing up in England, they will be lost to Yahadut. They will be lost to Judaism unless we have chinuch, we have education, schools and yeshivot and things like that. And there was none of that in England. And there were 400,000 Jews in England. And I was in charge of the one Jewish high school, namely the Hasmonean, Hashmonaim. And that had about 400 Jewish children. But there were 400,000 Jewish families in England, and they had no chinuch at all. And what's more, I saw, how did I keep that school going? I raised money. But in those days, the teachers were paid very little, almost nothing. And the time was coming when teachers had to be paid a living wage. We didn't have the money. So I wouldn't even be able to keep the one school that we had going, that I was running, I was in charge of. I put a lot of my own money into it, and I used to go around asking people to make contributions. But the salary of teachers was going up. They were earning very, very little before. It was going up. It was going to be like other professional people. So how could we keep going? That's even my school. And I was afraid for the Jewish community of England, the youngsters, there was no education for them, and what are we going to do? So I wrote 4 letters. I wrote one letter to the very frum Jewish community, They had a newspaper. And I wrote to them, and I said, we're going to be held to account. Our community will have to give din v'cheshbon b'shamayim that we did not build schools and we did not do anything for the education of the next generation so that they could remain Jewish. And I said, we all will have to give din v'cheshbon unless we press the government of Britain to fund, to give the money for it. Nobody agreed with me. אני הייתי היחיד שחשבתי ככה. I used to run the Hasmonean school, and I was the representative of the Golders Green Beis HaMedrash congregation, my shul. So I wrote very angry letters. Din v'cheshbon you'll have to give. Nobody agreed. and they thought my harsh words were too strong and were unjustified. Everybody thought so. Nobody agreed with me. But I was a respected member of the Anglo-Jewish community. And I wrote such a letter to the Frum Jewish community, to the general Jewish community, to the Jewish Chronicle, which caters for all aspects of the Jewish community, not from atheists and so on. They used to get the Jewish Chronicle. And I also wrote a letter to the London Times, to the Goyish newspaper that are read by the Goyim in England. And I wrote, "It is a terrible crime. It's a terrible crime that the government of Great Britain does not give aid to the Jewish schools. The government of Britain gives financial help to the Christian schools, but they don't give financial help to any other schools, and certainly not to the Jewish schools. And this is a big avla, a big rishus, and I protest strongly that the government of Britain doesn't help to educate the new generation of Jews in Yiddishkeit, in Judaism." And I wrote a very strong letter like that also to the Minister of Education of the British government, and that was a woman called Shirley Williams. Shirley Williams replied to my letter, and she said, "Come and see me, and we'll talk about it." And she knew that I only represented the Golders Green Beis Medrash, which was one school, one shul. Bring along all the representatives of all the other factions of the Jewish people in Great Britain, and bring them along. And she gave me an appointment to meet with her one day at 10 o'clock in the morning. So I contacted all the Jewish communities in England, and I said, "We have an invitation to meet Shirley Williams, the Minister of Education." So I contacted the United Synagogue, to which most Jews belonged, to the Chief Rabbi's office, to the conservatives, the Rishonim, to the reformers, to the liberals, to all the Jewish communities, that they should send along a representative with me to meet with Shirley Williams. We were 14 of us, and I represented the Golders Green Beis Medrash. I have a friend in Britain, his name is Professor Price, who davens with me in the Golders Green Beis Medrash, and he helped me to draw up a memorandum for Shirley Williams. I spent 2 days preparing that memorandum, in which I said, it's a terrible, terrible avla that the British government refuses to support Jewish schools and to establish Jewish schools. That means the destruction of the Jewish community in Great Britain, because we didn't have the money in those days. They didn't have the money, you know? Right. So there were 14 of us in the delegation of all the Jews visiting Shirley Williams. And we showed up there at between 10 and 10:30 one morning. It turned out that when I arrived, I gave Shirley Williams my memo that Professor Price helped me to draw up, and I spent 2 weeks preparing that memo. What a terrible avla it is that the British government doesn't supply the money to build Jewish schools and to support the Jewish schools, which it does for the Christian community. Big avla that they don't do it for the Jewish community. Before doing that, I hired an important lawyer, and I decided to take the British government to court, to the International Court in Strasbourg, to summon the British government to the International Court of the EU, of the European Community, of which Britain was a member, to force them to give state aid to the Jewish schools. But before I submitted the summons to the government of Great Britain, I asked he was that time the Gadol Hadar, and his name was Rav Moshe Feinstein. He was in the United States. He was the Rosh Yeshiva of Masifta Tiveres Yerushalayim, but he was the Gadol Hadar in those days, a long time ago. And I told him, I'm going to summon the British government to a din in Strasbourg to force them to give state aid for Jewish schools wherever there are more than 150 Jewish children. I have an answer, I got an answer from Rav Moshe Feinstein. And Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote to me that there can be nothing more important than to give chinuch to the new generation, which we're not able to do in England because we don't have the money, but to take them to a court, the British government to a court outside of England, which you wrote to me, your lawyer there said, I will win it. I don't know whether that will not cause ava, extreme hatred, if we force the British government to give state aid to Jewish schools. I don't know, he said, unless you are sure that this will not cause hatred of the Goyish population in Great Britain, then don't do it. If you're sure it will not cause ava, then go ahead and do it. But if you're not sure whether it will cause ava, that's extreme hatred, that we take the British government to a court outside of Great Britain and to force them to give money and to support Jewish education. Ava is a sakona for all their sinas Yisrael, but Ava, which we know, we know that Esav son of Yaakov, and that we know, Esav son of Yaakov, although they're very nice to us in Great Britain, but underneath it, Esav son of Yaakov. But you mustn't do anything that turns a sinas Yisrael into Ava, because that is a sakona to all the Jews in Great Britain. So you have to decide whether this can cause ava. If you're masupuk, whether it can cause ava, don't do it, because that can cause the destruction of the Jews of Great Britain. Well, I wasn't sure that this would cause ava or not, so I couldn't do it. That was the psak of the Gadol B'Yisrael. However, he continued in his letter, and I have a copy of this letter. I have a copy of the letter here, which I can show you, and I can make a copy. However, in Great Britain itself, if you take the British government to a court outside of Great Britain, this could possibly be greatly resented and cause aver in Great Britain. But in Great Britain, in England, and in Scotland, and in Wales, you must do everything you possibly can to obtain state aid, to save the Jewish people from being exterminated spiritually in Great Britain. So I was very disappointed to have this tshuva from Rav Moshe Feinstein, because I thought my lawyer said that if I take him to a court outside of Great Britain, I will probably win it. And so we'll have state aid for all Jewish children in Great Britain. They'll have to build schools, and they'll have to support the schools like they do for the Christian schools. I was very disappointed. So therefore I had to do it another way. I had to work hard from inside Great Britain. I could not take them to court outside Great Britain because what Moshe Feinstein said I mustn't do it because it could cause aver. So I wrote strong letters, as I told you, very strong letters to the Jewish community that they're going to have to give a din v'cheshbon, that they did not try harder to get state help for Jewish education in Britain. I wrote it to the Frum community, I wrote it to the general community in the Jewish Chronicle, and I wrote another letter to the London Times that it's a terrible injustice, a crime and an injustice, that the British government refuses to support Jewish schools and refuses to support Jewish education, which will mean the destruction of Judaism and of Yiddishkeit in England if we don't build Jewish schools and train teachers and so on. It's a great offer. I had a reply from Shirley Williams, the Minister of Education of the British government. She said, "You asked for a meeting, so I'm giving you an appointment at 10 o'clock in the morning, and bring along all the representatives of all the Jewish communities in Britain. I know that not all of them want the British government to support Jewish schooling, but bring them along." So Professor Price helped me to prepare a beautiful plea and report to Shirley Williams, begging her to give state aid to to build Jewish schools and to maintain Jewish schools in Great Britain, so that it will not mean the destruction of Judaism for the next generation. I prepared such a report, and then I showed up with 13 other people, each person representing another aspect of the Jewish community, including the chief rabbi. And we showed up at 10 o'clock in the morning at the office of Shirley Williams, the Minister of Education. When we got there, I gave Shirley Williams my plea and my report. So she said, "Wait." So she waited half an hour while she read it and studied it. And then she called in her 5 advisors, Chameshet HaYoatzim. And she told them, "Read this plea from Rabbi Kestenbaum, and they read it. By 11 o'clock in the morning, they had all read it. And then she said to me, you and your delegation, come back in 4 hours. We want to discuss it, and we'll give you our answer in 4 hours. So we all went home, and I went to the home of the chief rabbi, who was a wonderful man. He didn't agree with me. Nobody agreed with me. But I spent the time, the 4 hours in his home, and we all came back 4 hours later. About 2 in the afternoon, we all came back. Said, come back at 2 in the afternoon. We came back at 2 in the afternoon. She was there with her 5 advisors. And she said, Rabbi Kestenbaum, I read your report. You're not wrong. You're right. And the other people in my delegation were shocked. They didn't agree with me. The from ones like the chief rabbi, United Synagogue, would have liked to see the government give help to the Jewish community for educating. They didn't think that I have a right to ask to pay for it. If we can't afford it, it's too bad. Why should the government pay for Jewish education? They'll never agree to this. You're wasting your time. But everyone on the committee disagreed with me. And there I was, and she said, Rabbi Kestenbaum, you are right. But I ask you, why didn't you ask for this 35 years ago, when we were flush with money, when we had a lot of money, and we didn't have such a large children population, and now we don't have so much money, and we have so many of our own children, of the Christian children, and so many Christian schools. Why didn't you ask me 35 years ago? Now the chief rabbi, you can see, is a tzaddik. The chief rabbi is a tzaddik, because nobody likes to admit that he was wrong. Who likes to admit he was? If you're accused of something, then you make excuses. You don't like to admit he was wrong. Chief rabbi is a tzaddik. He said Rabbi Kestenbaum was right. But we, the rest of us of the Jewish community, we were all wrong. We were all wrong, and we didn't apply for it earlier. And Rabbi Kestenbaum is right. So she said, but the others in the delegation didn't agree. The United Synagogue, which is Orthodox, also agreed that I was right. She said, what shall I do? We don't have so much money now. And what shall I do now? You're right, but what shall we do now? Why didn't you apply 30 years ago? The chief rabbi said we were wrong. We should have applied for this 30 or 35 years ago. She said, what shall I give you now? We don't have so much money now, but we'll make an effort to give you. I said, firstly, give us money for the existing one school that we have to pay for the costs of running that school. She said, granted. Number 2, give us enough money so that we can establish schools wherever in Great Britain we have more than 150 Jewish children. She said, okay, that's a lot of schools. So she agreed. So she said, okay, prepare for me a list of where in all of Great Britain you want to have Jewish schools. You want Jewish schools. So I said, I will. It's a shame. So that was a tremendous success. Tremendous success. She said she will support Jewish education and Jewish schools. Wherever we have 150 Jewish schools, any town where we have over 150 Jewish children, they'll give us the money to build a Jewish school, and they'll provide the money to help run the school. Tremendous. So I drew up a list of wherever we had 150 Jewish schools in all of Great Britain. I came back 2 days later and I submitted it to her. She had agreed. As a result of that, the British government supports schools attended by 92% of all Jewish children in Great Britain. 92% of all Jewish children in Great Britain attend Jewish schools, supported by the British government. It's moidetic, isn't it? As a result of that, 92% of Jewish children in Great Britain attend Jewish schools where they get a Torah education. And the government also helped me to train the teachers for this and all the other expenses. Finish.